This is a result of hi everyone, I'm Renee and I am a colleague of Susan's at Macquarie University. I am on the history side of the geography kind of hissy world, and it is quite a common phenomenon actually here in Australia, whereby if you are geography trained, the expectation is that you teach history. So I've taught a lot of probably very horrible geography lessons over my years of teaching, but it has become quite a phenomenon in hissy staff rooms that we do have to do this out of field teaching. This is the title of my presentation, and so this has come out of my PhD research actually, in terms of this was actually just a wider study of looking at beginning teacher experiences and their boundary crossing. What I actually found came out of my social labs, it was quite compelling actually, was the intensity and the experiences of these teachers who were teaching out of field. It was quite compelling. I thought, wow, I really actually thought it's quite beneficial to look into some of the experiences because they're actually quite intense, and I think they're very worth looking at. Before I go any further though, I did want to acknowledge the traditional custodians also. I've chosen the yarning circle image as well from Macquarie University, of the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and they continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. And I do pay my sincere respects to elders present, past, present and emerging, and I think it's very appropriate that we're giving voice today to teachers who are marginalised in the same way that I'm really sad that we weren't able to give voice to our Indigenous Australians in the referendum on Saturday. In terms of the research context, look, I won't go too far into this, but it was that wider investigation into looking at the experiences of teachers in their first year. They had just completed that 4-year undergraduate degree, trained as secondary teachers, and the requirements are really quite specific. I kind of feel like they got the trifecta in that they had first year out teachers, you had the impacts of COVID, those lingering impacts where schools were trying to remain operational and open. It was kind of dire straits, survival of the fittest. Schools were closing, you know, exodus of students. It was just a really tough time to start teaching. And then on top of that, you had them having to go through, for a number of them, this out of field teaching experience. There was ease because we do have these acute teacher shortages. They actually found it quite easy to get a job, but there still are issues around permanency of job status here in New South Wales. So you have teachers who are getting a full-time year contract, but they're not actually able to extend that feeling of permanency, which I think also too has an impact on this out of field nexus just a little bit as well. And also just generally speaking here in New South Wales, you know, there is a lot of negativity still that surrounds teachers and the work that we do, and a lack of appreciation for that. In terms of the aims and significance and questions, I really wanted to explore the way that out of field teaching shapes the lived experience of these beginning teachers, how it impacts their identity formation, and not just in that personal context, but also in a professional context as well. What support structures are available that schools are putting them in, willingly knowing that they are teaching out of field, that they're putting them into this predicament, but what support structures are they offering? That awful question of sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and you've got these teachers who are gung-ho, willing, passionate about changing young lives, and they're being placed into these scenarios whereby that is not being matched by the school's impetus really to try and support them in these endeavours. And I also wanted to look at the implications on this, on career aspirations, short and long term. We're all here for, and in the emphasis of time, in terms of the literature, we know about out of field teaching, we know about teacher shortages, and that out of field teaching is very much being used to plug teacher shortages as a short-term fix, and it's not ideal. I did want to just say very briefly, in terms of some of the transition literature, we know that this is a really, really intense time for beginning teachers. It is a very intense framing of identity. We also know that this is a vulnerable phase, and where most of our teachers are choosing to leave the profession, it is in this kind of 3 to 5 year period that we're losing them. Some are suggesting even shorter. And I know that some of the research is now suggesting that, that the out of field teaching is contributing to this also. It's about developing your sense as a teacher. These first few years are about galvanizing what you've learnt in terms of knowledge and experience, trying to bring that past and synthesize that with the reality of actually being in the classroom looks like. And that is a really intense, challenging period. We know that teaching out of field then adds an additional layer of complexity to this. We know that induction and mentoring are a really good way of helping to support teachers in terms of retention levels, in terms of their job satisfaction and their long-term commitment to the profession. But really what we know is that out of field teaching is interrupting, intensifying and prolonging this process of trying to become a subject teacher. So this is a multi-case qualitative study. My theoretical framing, and I'm going to just go over very quickly because I really want to get to the findings because that's where the interest is. But I have looked at Ackerman and Backer's boundary experience because I think it's a really good way to demonstrate what this process of being in that betwixt and between really looks like for these teachers, and how it really does make it a much more complex process for teachers to come to terms with. So we know that learning involves boundaries. It's this idea about it's an unfamiliar learning domain. For first year teachers, it's this: we arrive at the teacher gate fresh from university, and it's what does this beginning teacher journey kind of look like for them? It's this betwixt and between, and a liminal process, or this borderland territory of negotiating what this looks like. I really like Van Gennep's The Rites of Passage and Turner's tripartite model of liminality here, where you have that initial separation from what you know, you enter the gates of the classroom, and this liminal phase, and it is an undefined period of time. It's where this questioning, it's a bit chaotic, but there is a learning and galvanizing and synthesizing of ideas. And what happens is then you want those ideas to synthesize in order for you to move out of this liminal phase of this kind of threshold experience, or limen actually means the threshold. In terms of my research participants, for this study, I looked at 3 because these were the ones that most intensely went through this period. I had Cleo, Elle, and Wendy. I have a Cleo too, Susan. I think perhaps the most interesting here was Wendy. She was a geography teacher, but she was actually, in terms of her teaching load, given 5 out of field teaching subjects. 2 of those were stage 6. So stage 6 for Fiona, that's equivalent to your A levels. So the intensity, I saw the grimace there. So the intensity of the level of subject knowledge that she needs to learn is really quite acute. We have Elle, who 100% of her teaching load was out of field. So she's history Spanish trained, but was given an English and French load. And she was the only French teacher in the school. So again, you kind of get an idea here that they are really kind of out of their depth a little bit. The actual research was 3 social labs pitted at the beginning, middle and end of the academic year. I used visual vignettes, which I will get into a moment, and also some interviews to follow up. Like Susan, the social labs are brilliant. I really recommend them. The amount of discussion that comes out of them is amazing. And it is this investigation of a wicked problem. It's an iterative process where you facilitate, and hopefully some of those problems can be solved by the beginning teachers who are employed. I then used the interviews afterwards to really kind of drill down into what was their experience of the social labs, beginning teaching, and also to explore these visual vignettes. Oh, I've gone, sorry. I was trying to move all of your faces. So what I did is I created some visual vignettes They were based on my own emic experience of teaching. And so when I searched for these images, I really just wanted them to explore that liminal phase. So whatever images I found were based on threshold, beginning teaching, spaces of liminality, to try and give them the opportunity to tap into other things that weren't necessarily speech or writing. And it was just amazing what they came up with. What was really interesting is I laminated all of these and they were up in the room while the social labs went on. And what they did was, and this was completely unprompted, they walked up immediately when I said to them, to take them all in and look at them. And I gave them prompts as well as part of this, coming to terms with what these vignettes meant to them. And they took them off. They were all blue tacked and they took them off and they held them here to their chest and they came and they sat and they talked around them. So they really took ownership of what a lot of these images meant to them. It was fascinating actually as a phenomenological kind of experiment of what happened. But it was this idea that they're also supposed to hypothetically represent something or a feeling of how they were going over the course of the year. And each of them chose a different representation over the course of the year. So they all had 3 images that they walked away with. And I asked them, I had these prompts that which one resonates with you the most? What does it mean to be in a boundary space? I used to think teaching was, and now I think it is, and this is how long I intend on staying in the profession. And I asked them those questions over the course of all 3 social labs. In terms of my data, I did Brown and Clark's thematic analysis and a combination of the inductive and deductive coding. So I used Kelcherman's personal interpretive framework to help me to come up with some of those terms. But what I really want to do very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, but in terms of my findings, I found there were 4 key themes that really came out. And again, it's this idea about the impact on the relationships. In terms of colleagues and both students, that there was no time to build, authentic relationships with colleagues. And they often felt that there was a strain on those relationships with their colleagues because they constantly felt like they were asking for help all the time, that they were still in that sort of position of there's a power imbalance there because they continually felt like they weren't on equal footing with a lot of their colleagues. In terms of students, I still found, and when they spoke, their primary focus or a lot of the stress for them was getting over that content knowledge barrier rather than actually being able to ask questions. And Wendy particularly spoke about the fact she didn't really feel like she could be herself with her students. So there were impacts there. I'm going to show you my code book on personal identity in a moment. In terms of professional identity, there was no real opportunities for them to build on their in-field subject knowledge. And for all of them, this was a key call to teaching for them. They all talked about that subject knowledge was the reason that they became teachers. There is a lack of sufficient mentoring in their out-of-field subject that they are teaching, and professional development was either ad hoc or just non-existent. In terms of workplace dynamics, I've kind of hinted at this already, but these shortages were being filled by beginning teachers, and schools willingly knowing that they are beginning teachers, kind of putting them into this situation and not giving them the support that they need to function and to really do well, or to put them in a position whereby they can flourish as teachers. And what I noticed was that there was a growing resentment on the part of these teachers that the school had put them in this unfair position, that they'd taken them on board knowing full well that this was the scenario. And what you have then is staff rooms that actually don't then have the experience really to buoy them up in terms of student learning. What I have here is just one example. So this is one part of my coding, and just in terms of the professional identity formation, I just really wanted to drill down and just give you a little bit of an idea of the impact. And if you go down to that bottom section there, in terms of looking at some of that emotional sort of complexity there, there's a lack of capacity, and Elle actually ended up going to psychologists to cope, and it was fairly significant, very regular appointments with a psychologist in order to be able to say, okay, I can get through this week, I can get through this month, because Elle was teaching completely 100% out of field. She had no help, so she was doing assessment tasks, all the resources she was building herself, and the strain. Her second interview, she cried almost the entirety of the interview, just the pure, the stress, the exhaustion of actually having to continue to work that load was awful for her. And so so I have examples of all of these code books if you are interested, but the evidence from them is quite compelling. They were very generous with their responses and very candid in terms of, you know, of what they said. Very quickly, these are Cleo's vignettes. The difference, I think, with Cleo was that she was given a bit of agency, and she also spent a lot of time independently going and finding professional development in her subject area. So history was her area, and she said despite feeling like she wasn't able to sort of really engage in any history teaching at all, she went and sought out professional associations of her own volition. Now, not everybody does that, and I think that was part of the problem for her, is that she was actually quite exhausted in terms of trying to seek out and nourish that part of her identity, in terms of not being fueled by the school or supported in that way. And she, again, even by the second social lab, was thinking about exploring other opportunities beyond teaching, or at least doing some more sort of resource development in history teaching. Elle's journey was really sad, and I thought this was really compelling. You can see from the types of images there that she's chosen that it's quite a lonely road for her. She said she feels like she's been thrown in the middle of a fire and being told to light with a dripping wet box of matches, and everyone being like, but we've given you matches, it's not that hard. But the matches were entirely useless because they were sopping wet. And so I think for her, she was the one that ended up going to see the psychologist, and this was her journey. Interestingly, sort of quite lonely, she ended up choosing 2 images at the end, and she chose that fire one again, feeling burnt out, feeling very much alone. And she, 2 of the teachers left their schools at the end of the year to find other posts where they could try and at least get some in-field teaching. And they still express this feeling of, you know, we feel like we're starting all over again by going in. In terms of Wendy's journey, she's still hopeful that things will get better. What was really interesting here for her about this last image, and I remember somebody else in the social labs who wasn't doing out of area teaching chose this particular image because of that idea about the teacher nurturing the student. Actually, for Wendy, she still couldn't get out of her own head, and this was experienced out of field teacher telling little beginning teacher at the end that, you know, this is probably not really a path that you want to go down, and you'll get through. So it was a really kind of, almost, I felt like a sad indictment for Wendy, in that she really struggled to find her way in that scope. So I think that, yeah, she's trying to be protective of herself so that she feels like she may be able to stay in teaching in the long term. But again, she was very kind of disillusioned. How long have I got, Linda?
Time's up, I'm afraid.
Okay, time's up.
Maybe 1 or 2 key points next. And,
this is where I'm up to. So I think that it intensifies that experience. It impacted their whole approach to their relationships. It was completely overwhelming. And I think the sad part here is that schools are knowingly hiring them and schools knowing they don't have the support structures to help them. In terms of a couple of recommendations here, if there's any way that you can avoid giving a first year out teacher, you know, an out of field teaching subject area, that would be great. If not, keep it minimal, keep it to a lower year group, perhaps even, whereas it's not stage 6 or that kind of A-level area. we really need to think about how we approach PD and also any of those mechanisms that we can help as to help early career teachers whilst they're at university. And so that is it. I'm so sorry I went over time.